Good morning, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I want to thank those who came to the club for our headliner newsmakers this morning, as well as those who are joining us via live stream. I'm Michelle Salcedo, former editor at Axios and at the Associated Press. I also served as president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists from 2010 to 2012, and I'm a former National Press Club secretary. Today we're joined by Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas. Congressman Castro is in his 5th term as the U.S. representative from Texas' 20th District, which includes his hometown of San Antonio. From 2019 to 2020, he was chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Congressman Castro came to the National Press Club last year to present the first part of a Government Accountability Office report that he requested on the underrepresentation of Latinos in media. He's back today during Hispanic Heritage Month to release the second part of the GAO's findings. The investigation shows with strong data and analysis what many of us in this room and who are watching at home and in your offices already know, that Latinos are not well represented in media, whether on the screen or behind the scenes, and that includes Hollywood, book publishing, and sadly, in newsrooms. Congressman Castro also will talk about concrete steps some media companies have taken to better represent Latinos and how federal laws and agencies may be used to get results. We are also delighted to be joined today by Sonia Perez, acting CEO of Unidos US, the largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the nation. In addition to leading Unidos US, Ms. Perez has also conducted and published research on Latino social policy and demographic issues, including editing Moving Up the Economic Ladder, Latinos and the Nation's Future Prosperity, which examined the current employment status of Latino workers and the different factors that influence their socioeconomic mobility. Now we have a little housekeeping. We'll begin with some brief remarks from Ms. Perez and Congressman Castro, followed by some time for questions and answers. For those of you in the room, if you have a question, please write it on the cards that have been circulated and pass them to Kate. Kate, where are you? Her hand is up. She's going to be collecting those cards. Remember to print legibly. I can't ask what I can't read, and I want to ask as many questions as we have time for. For those of you who are watching online, email your question to headliners@press.org. We're looking forward to an insightful discussion today. Thank you both for joining us. Sonia, the podium is yours.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. It's really a privilege for me and for Unidos US to join today with our longtime partner and champion, Representative Joaquin Castro, to discuss a critically important issue in our community, the continued and severe underrepresentation of Latinos in the media. During his time in Congress, Representative Castro and Unidos US have worked together on a host of issues affecting our community, including education, economic empowerment, and voting rights. Yet there is no question that our ability to advance policy changes that expand opportunities for Latinos on any of these major issues is thwarted by the perceptions of our fellow Americans have of the Latino community. Our own recent polling research confirmed 2 things. First, that most Americans know very little about Latinos, not our contributions or our challenges. And second, that there is an empathy gap among Americans when it comes to the Hispanic community. While 20% of those surveyed view our community negatively, the majority are simply indifferent to us. In short, the real story of the Latino community remains largely untold. That's why Unidos US has made changing the narrative about our community a top priority for our organization. We recently launched a campaign in Arizona called Count on Us that showcases the importance of the Latino community's social and economic contributions to that state. And that's why we're also here today in support of the incredible work Congressman Castro has done on this issue over the last several years. We wholeheartedly agree with him that at the core of the Latino community's image challenges is our ongoing lack of representation overall and positive representation specifically in the media, both in front of and behind the camera. And it's distressing that we're still talking about this issue of Hispanic media underrepresentation. Nearly 30 years ago, Unidos US, which was then known as the National Council La Raza, documented the virtual invisibility of Latinos in the media. We noted that, quote, it was easier to see an alien from outer space than someone Hispanic, end quote, on screen. Off screen, we highlighted the almost complete absence of Latinos and Latinas in the executive ranks of the major media companies. And 3 decades later, the GAO report that Representative Castro commissioned in 2021 found that the media industry continues to lag behind virtually every other industry when it comes to Latino representation. And today, Latinos and Latinas only make up 4% of management, while 8 of 10 executives are white. In short, the media industry is failing the Latino community at a time when, in so many ways, Hispanics are the nation's future. And let me share why. When we did our studies, there were 22 million Hispanics in the country, 11% of the population. This year in 2022, there are 62 million Latinos, and we're nearly 1 in 5 Americans. The number of Latinos in the workforce has tripled since we did our reports. We're nearly 1 in 5 American workers, and 70% of us are essential workers. Our buying power is 10 times larger than it was 30 years ago, and it's now up to $1.9 trillion. And perhaps most relevant to today's discussion, Hispanics are more likely than others to consume media. According to Nielsen, Latinos watch more television and stream more than the average American. And while we're 19% of the population, we are 29% of moviegoers. Greater Latino media representation is not just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. Our community is doing its part to tell the accurate story of Latinos in this country. And one way is through our all-out effort to establish a National Museum of the American Latino as part of the Smithsonian. But it's time for the media industry to truly step up. There is no question that progress has been made in the last 30 years, but as the Congressman will show in just a few minutes, it's not been nearly enough. We look forward to working with Congressman Castro to ensure that the report's recommendations are widely disseminated and adopted. And thanks to his extraordinary leadership, this issue, a key part of achieving greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, is once again front and center for our community and for the country. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody this morning. I'm Congressman Joaquin Castro, and I proudly represent my hometown of San Antonio, Texas, here in the United States House of Representatives. I want to say thank you, Sonia, for those kind words about me, but also, more importantly, for all the work that you and Unidos have done over the years on this issue and so many others. Unidos.us has been at the forefront of Latino civil rights and advocacy for more than half a century, and it's an honor to have you here as we release this report. And it's also a privilege to be back at the National Press Club to mark Hispanic Heritage Month and continue this important conversation about Latino representation in American media. I consider it a foundational issue for our community. And thank you, Peter and Kate, for generously sharing your space and helping us spread the word about this event. And thank you also, Michelle, for your decades of work to uplift Latino stories and advance the careers of Latino and Latina journalists. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the partners who played an important role in helping this report come together, and also those who have helped me on this work over the past 3 years, including a colleague of mine, Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, and members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus who joined me as co-requesters on this report. Also, folks who have been advocates on this issue for quite some time. I mentioned that I've been working in earnest on this issue pretty hard for about 3 years, but there are many people inside and outside the industry who have been working for much longer than that. And so I want to say thank you to a few folks. First, of course, Unidos, LULAC also, who has also spoken up over the years, Brenda Castillo and the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Felix Sanchez, who I think is here, and the National Foundation for the Arts, Rafael Agustin in Los Angeles and the Latino Film Institute with Eddie James Olmos and all of the incredible work that they've done. The Latino Advisory Council, some of whom are in this room, that we informally put together a coalition of organizations over the last year or so to take on this issue. The folks who have done incredible research as well, the Latino Donor Collaborative with Ana Valdez, Ana Cristina Ramon at UCLA, Stacy Smith at USC. Now, those are some of the folks on the entertainment side, but remember, we're talking about media across platforms. So when we think about hard news and journalism, thank you to the National Association of Hispanic Journalists for all of their incredible work and advocacy over the years. And in my hometown, the San Antonio Association of Hispanic Journalists, who's done the same kind of great work in San Antonio. And that's entertainment, hard news, and then you have publishing, book publishing. Over the last few years, there's been a wonderful group that has developed called Latinx in Publishing, and also Dignidad Literaria, who's done great work in pushing for change in publishing. And then finally, I want to say a big thank you to all of the DEI folks at the respective companies and organizations who I know are working hard day in and day out to change these numbers and to change Latino representation within their companies. Now, whether they're actually listened to and appreciated and whether their advice is heeded is sometimes a different story. But I know where their heart is, I know where their mind is, and so I want to say thank you to all of them. And then finally, I said that I represent San Antonio. I want to say a big thank you to all of the San Antonians who have inspired me, all of the organizations and people who have inspired me to do this work, including requesting this very, very important report. And so there's so many others who have worked within the industry to open doors, tell Latino stories, and contribute to the GAO's research on this important topic. You know, as a kid growing up on the west side of San Antonio, in neighborhoods that were probably 95% Latino, I was often glued to the television, as I'm sure that many of you were, and I made it to the movies whenever I got a chance. And so I was a big fan of the 80s shows. I loved shows like Family Ties and Who's the Boss and Knight Rider and movies like The Breakfast Club. You know, so many of the shows and movies that now, as we're getting older, we would consider classics. But the faces and the places that I saw on screen back then, and really since then, hardly ever matched the reality around me on the west side of San Antonio. Latinos make up nearly 20% of our nation, and our contributions have shaped this country's development and prosperity for centuries. But despite our numbers and growing power, our stories have been systematically excluded from Hollywood and the American media, which are the dominant image-creating and narrative-defining institutions in our nation, and therefore in the world. In the past, I've narrowed in on Hollywood as a particular example of this problem, but the publishing industry, as the source material, is the nexus for what ends up often on screen and also in our classrooms, in the textbooks that our kids learn about. In hard news, the less diverse that our newsrooms are, the less likely they are to be able to accurately and authentically describe the community that they're covering. The GAO report that we're here to discuss today is an opportunity to tie all of those fields together and look at the impact of Latino exclusion across the American media industry and what it means. Over the years, study after study has shown that Latinos are missing from the movies we watch, the textbooks our children read, and the mastheads of the newspapers that shape how Americans see their communities and how they see the world. As a result, it's clear that our fellow Americans simply don't know who Latinos are, not only because of American media, but I believe partly because of American media. And I'll start with an example that summarizes this problem quite well. Last year, researchers at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School released a report on Latino representation in top-grossing recent films that provides a good illustration of the scale of this problem. Across 1,300 top-grossing films from 2007 to 2019, just 3.5% of lead roles went to Hispanic or Latino actors or actresses. This marks a kind of invisibility in American society. In more than 40% of these films, and keep in mind that these are the box office winners that most Americans see, there were no Latino characters at all. In other words, a whole community that represents almost 20% of the country didn't even exist in those films. I've long argued that this kind of invisibility helps create a void in narrative, a black hole, where stereotypes and bigotry can fester. And when we look at the films where Latinos were represented, this becomes especially clear. In 100 of the top-grossing films from 2019, nearly 40% of top-billed Hispanic and Latino characters were depicted as criminals or ex-convicts. 40%. Think about what that means for a community. So if you're growing up in a small town or even in a big city without many Latinos, and the only ones you see on screen are criminals, imagine how that shapes your worldview and what you think of that community. And you all know that we're in the middle of a political season now, and we've got just over a month to go until this big midterm election. And many of the folks in this room, I know many of y'all understand how campaign commercials work, played on repeat. Negative ads played over and over and over can help sear an impression of a candidate or something else in the public's mind. That's why candidates run for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, the same negative ads over and over. I would compare those political ads and the negativity to what Hollywood has done for generations to Latinos, running the same ad over and over of Latinos being criminals or convicts or gang members or drug runners, Latinas as hypersexualized. There is an effect over time on the audience of that kind of delivery. For decades, the American media industry has been running an extended commercial about Latinos that focuses on the most harmful stereotypes of who we are. On screen and on the front pages of major newspapers, Latinos are portrayed as gangbangers, as drug dealers, and as quote-unquote illegals. These depictions obscure the positive real-life roles of Latinos as essential workers who got us through the early days of the pandemic, immigrant entrepreneurs giving new life to cities in the Midwest, and trailblazers across almost every American industry. So it's not just a question that we're talking about today of which actor or actress gets a role in a particular movie or TV show. The defining images and narratives that come out of American media affect every Latino or Latina, no matter their walk of life, who, for example, may be interviewing to be an accountant, a lawyer, an engineer, or a teacher, in a room full of strangers who see them as American media has defined our community. In other words, all of us walking around with brown skin or with a Spanish last name or however we identify as Latino are somehow marked by that generations-long campaign that I spoke about and continues today. And as these negative stereotypes permeate the American imagination, they become dangerous tools for unscrupulous politicians to use and abuse for their own gain. The result, the marriage of political expediency and damning stereotypes, produces in its worst iteration the kind of tragedy we saw in El Paso, Texas, where a madman drove 10 hours to stop what he called the, quote, Hispanic invasion of Texas. My focus today is on Latino representation, but it's important to note that the same phenomenon has consequences for other ethnic groups as well. For example, in the early days of the pandemic, irresponsible journalism about the spread of the virus led to a spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans. That, combined with the political malfeasance and malevolence, particularly of our former president, led to a spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans. So this isn't contained just to the Latino community. It becomes much easier to convince Americans to fear their neighbors when the media has already primed the pump. So let me recap for a second, because I said this was the second part of this very important GAO report. Let me recap for a second the first part, which came out last year. A little context to that. So over the years, I've met with top American media executives, and I've come to believe that the root cause of these problems is that Latinos have not been given the opportunity to tell our stories or to shape the way that those stories are told. Last year, I released the results of a groundbreaking report on Latino representation in media from the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, an independent, nonpartisan agency funded by the federal government. The report showed that Latinos are vastly underrepresented in the American media industry, where we make up just 12% of the workforce, compared to about 18% of the total non-media workforce. And when we look more closely at the data, an even deeper portrait of underrepresentation emerges. In the media industry's service sector, the custodians, food workers, and others who keep the industry moving, 22% of staff are actually Latino. But at the top of the industry, among managers and executives with the power to decide which projects move forward, just 4% of workers are Latino. Latinos prop up media companies as moviegoers, streamers, gamers, and more. We disproportionately subsidize the industry's tax breaks in places like California and New Mexico, states that have Latino populations that are both above 40%. But at many of America's largest media companies, there are few, if any, Latinos on the board of directors or in senior leadership roles. Unfortunately, this trend has only worsened over the last several years because of consolidation in the media industry. Last year, as corporate executives lobbied regulators to approve a $43 billion merger between Discovery and Warner Media, I wrote, along with other members of Congress, to the Justice Department, warning that the merger would eliminate competition and opportunities for Latino workers and others. In March, the newly formed Warner Brothers Discovery announced a 13-member board of directors without a single Latino. And executives proceeded with a slew of cancellations that snuffed out the potential of Latino-driven stories like Batgirl for a tax break and others like Gordita Chronicles. That is a form of systemic exclusion. After the release of last year's report, the Government Accountability Office went back to work to produce a broader analysis of the factors contributing to Latino underrepresentation in media and to assess the role of the federal government in addressing this systemic problem. Over the last several decades, most major corporations have made commitments to improving workforce diversity, and I actually believe that many of those commitments are sincere. But the GAO's data, newly released today, makes clear that over the last decade, the level of Latino employment in American media, the levels have barely budged. The problem is especially acute for Latinas, who make up just 3% of workers in the media industry when you exclude service jobs. Now, the fundamental question is this: what do we do about that, and how does the federal government play a role? To answer that, GAO researchers reviewed government policy and industry practices, analyzed workforce participation data, and conducted a series of interviews with stakeholders from across the media industry to get their perspectives on the challenges at the heart of this issue. The stakeholders identified a range of issues that are outlined at length in the report, which has been provided online, and I believe we have copies for folks as well. And I want to touch on just a few of these things, and then, of course, we'll have a more extended discussion. But first, financial barriers. Of the stakeholders interviewed by the GAO, many describe serious obstacles to working in the media industry, beginning with the burden of unpaid internships and junior positions that pay below a living wage. Even at more senior levels, compensation models such as royalties that pay out small sums over several years can make it extraordinarily difficult for people from modest means to stay in the industry. So there's a problem being able to recruit people because of the terrible pay, either unpaid internships or very low-paying jobs, and then a problem retaining people as well. So several months ago, I held a roundtable for executives from a major publishing house to hear feedback from Latino authors and talent agents about increasing Latino representation within the field. Several of the authors pointed to low advances, for example, as a major inhibitor to their careers, and urged publishers to take a hard look at their data to evaluate whether Latino and Latina authors are being paid fairly, and I hope that the industry will in fact do that, and will press them to do that. The second, but no less significant barrier identified in the GAO's report is challenges with accessing professional networks, including unions, which can require a baseline level of experience as a condition of membership. So one additional challenge cited in the report is the dearth of Latino representation among talent agents, media executives, and other decision makers, and the subsequent lack of imagination about the stories we can tell. As my good friend, the author Julissa Adesep put it, Latino authors can write romance, horror, nonfiction, and every genre imaginable. because Latino stories are all of those things, but the media industry needs to be willing to see that and to open its eyes to that. I also want to point out, I've been very critical here, both in my work over the past 3 years and in reporting the first GAO installment and now this one, on the corporate side and the studio side. And in fact, the corporations do bear a heavy role or responsibility for much of this, but it's not just a corporate issue, and it's not just a studio issue. The guilds, the unions, the talent agencies also have a large role to play in opening up the doors to publishing, hard news, and Hollywood. And now I also want to give some credit where credit is due. The GAO report outlines several significant steps that major media companies have taken to increase diversity within their ranks, including tying executive compensation to achieving diversity goals and prioritizing succession planning that includes leaders from diverse backgrounds. But in my discussion with media leaders, I've become increasingly convinced that the industry is not going to be able to solve this problem on its own. Latinos over-index as movie ticket buyers, and recent research from Dr. Ana Cristina Ramon and her colleagues at the University of California, Los Angeles, have shown that Latinos and other minorities play a huge role in the success of streaming films, for example. And yet, despite that fact, despite the fact that this community props up the media industry, the industry over all of these years has hardly budged in terms of change. So despite these clear profit motives and incentives, systemic underrepresentation has persisted across all sectors of the media industry. Unfortunately, I suspect that existing patterns will continue until the federal government steps in to set standards for how media companies should conduct themselves. In today's report, the Government Accountability Office looked at the ways that government regulators currently enforce equal opportunity and found several gaps that can be fixed without new legislation or even major regulatory overhauls. Right now, federal regulators have many tools available to ensure workforce diversity, but gaps in data sharing and reporting have made it much harder to root out discrimination. As an example, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, relies on companies to self-report discrimination complaints filed against them, which inevitably results in an incomplete picture of what's going on. If the EEOC, the main regulator overseeing equal opportunity, shared the information it has with the FCC and vice versa, the federal government would have a much more complete picture of whether media companies are following federal anti-discrimination statutes, and the FCC could use that information when deciding whether to renew station licensing. Labor unions, as I mentioned before, also play a major gatekeeping role in media, and the EEOC correspondingly requires certain unions to file a report on the demographics of their members. But the EEOC's union list isn't complete, and it needs the cooperation of local unions to build a full picture of who should be required to file these reports, which I hope that it will receive. I hope it will receive the cooperation of our American labor unions. In federal agency responses to the GAO's recommendations, both the EEOC and FCC acknowledged the value of data sharing between the two agencies and committed to exploring opportunities for further collaboration. This week, my office is sending a letter to the FCC and the EEOC that asks them to move swiftly to execute the recommendations in the GAO's report. Along with my colleagues, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Congressman David Cicilline, and others who have been active in the antitrust space, I will also continue to urge regulators to carefully consider how proposed media mergers can impact the Latino community. And there is clear evidence that corporate mergers reduce job opportunities for women and people of color. And I would like to see antitrust regulators push much harder to protect Latino employment during a time of increasing corporate consolidation. Federal regulators play an important role in enforcing equal opportunity, but I also want to touch briefly on some of the other work I've done in collaboration with many of the folks in this room to open more doors for Latinos and Latinas in media. First, I've engaged directly with more than a dozen major media companies across various platforms to seek accountability on these very issues. Second,
I've worked with members of Congress and state legislators to apply greater scrutiny to public subsidies that benefit media and entertainment companies. Too many of our communities are subsidizing their own exclusion, and that absolutely needs to change. Third, I've put forward legislation to use the influence of the federal government to drive change. As an example, I got an amendment into the National Apprenticeship Act that would open up Department of Labor support to the media and entertainment industries for paid apprenticeships to get more Latinos and others into the field. That bill, while it passed the House, like so many others, is stalled in the Senate. Fourth, I've nominated or supported the nomination of Latinos to federal boards and commissions and pushed for Latino inclusion in the National Film Registry. Finally, I've worked closely with a coalition of advocates inside and outside of the industry to shine a spotlight on the lack of Latino representation in media and entertainment. We need the media industry to understand that this is a foundational issue for Latinos and for the country at large. Latinos can no longer afford to be sidelined by the media industry and afford to be invisible because of it. Their decisions, the media industry's decisions about which stories to tell, which actors to cast, and which authors to publish will shape the future for Latinos in America. In the early 2000s, major film studios made a commitment to eliminate smoking in films for children and young adults, and their efforts almost eradicated smoking for a generation of young adults. By making a concerted effort to increase Latino representation, the media industry has the ability to help change the way that Americans see and appreciate the country's growing Latino community. American media has incredible power to affect cultural change, and Latinos are counting on the industry to use that. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation with Michelle, and I appreciate the effort of others in this room who have done so much, and also the journalists who are covering this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman, let's start with the bureaucracy and then work from there. You mentioned that the EEOC and the FCC have an important role to play, and if they would share data, we would be further along. It would be easier to see where we are falling short and perhaps address where those shortcomings are. But in the report, I noticed there was a hesitancy. There seemed to be a hesitancy from the EEOC to share data with the FCC.
Yeah, the EEOC, it's interesting. When you read the report, the FCC basically said, hey, we'll start moving on these recommendations. But the EEOC didn't make a comment on the recommendations or say whether they were going to move forward. And so that's the purpose of the letter that we're sending today. And I'm going to be requesting a meeting with the EEOC here shortly. They are an essential part of enforcement, because if you look at the history of discrimination suits, there hasn't been strong enforcement in the media industry and in other industries on this front. And so I want to make sure that they have all the tools they need for enforcement.
I noticed that in the report, the number of cases that the EEOC investigated, as well as the FCC, were included, and I was very sad to see that they were in the low single digits.
Yeah, you're right. I don't want to say that it's been non-existent, but it's been sparse. And and so I think there's still obviously a lot of work to do on the executive branch to make sure that enforcement is robust. And I start from, and remember, when you talk about anti-discrimination efforts, there have got to be specific cases, right? Somebody's got to come forward with a specific and legitimate, reasonable claim. But let's just look at the numbers, for example, so that we have the context. I want to take, for example, the city of Los Angeles. The entertainment industry is based in the city of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the country's second largest city. It's a city that is 48% Latino. It's the city in the country that has the most Latinos of any city in the United States. And so Latinos get overall, if you combine in front of and behind the camera work in the entertainment industry, about 7 or 7.5% of the work. Well, Los Angeles is a city that is 48% Latino. Right, so how do you go from a city that's 48, you got 48% of your population, and then you've got this huge industry that's based in that city, And the industry is only comprised in front of and behind the camera about 7.5% of that population. It's amazing. And so again, claims have to be specific against a specific company and so forth. But if you look at what's going on in the industry, it's incredibly troubling.
It also takes a big toll and a lot of energy and a lot of commitment on the part of someone, especially in media, which is such a closed industry on so many levels, to bring a complaint against an employer because there's concern about being blackballed and about not being hired
Absolutely.
in other places.
No,
But if it takes that much energy to file those complaints and the EEOC is prosecuting or the FCC is prosecuting very few of them, what can be done to incentivize the EEOC and the FCC to prosecute those cases a little more credibly?
Oh, that's a great question. You're right. You know, over the years, I've come across folks in the media industry who have been reluctant to file EEOC complaints because they fear that they're not going to be hired by the next media company or they'll be blacklisted essentially. And throughout American history, this has been an industry that has blacklisted people as a matter of fact. And so that is a legitimate fear. And it's something that we've got to continue to look at and work on from Congress. And also, I think the executive branch, I think, has got to redouble its efforts to make sure that workers are protected when they do come forward.
So let's get a little more personal. As father of two young Latino children,
There are three now. I have a 5-month-old daughter.
three,
so
congratulations.
8-year-old, 6-year-old, and a 5-month-old.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
How do you control the images of Latinos that your kids see? And how do you control what they watch? What do you tell them?
That's a great question. You know, my wife Anna and I have tried hard to expose them to positive role models and positive books about the Latino community, about our Mexican American community in San Antonio. But I worry about, like I said, over time, what they watch on television or what they'll be watching in movies. To me, as somebody in politics, I compare the intergenerational negativity that's been displayed on screen about Latinos to a long-running negative political ad against the community that leaves a long-lasting impression in the minds of kids, of adults, of everyone about, you know, who the community is. And so, yeah, it's a big concern for me. Right now, as you can imagine, because they're so young, we're better able to control, as parents, what they're exposed to. But as they get older, it obviously becomes much tougher.
So when I was growing up, because I'm 1,000 years old, the Cisco Kid and Zorro were, I believe Disney had produced them and they were running on television. So there was a little history lesson there and an opportunity to see Don Diego de la Vega swashbuckling his way through for justice. But you mentioned that there were no Latino characters when you were growing up. None at all?
No, I mean, I think there were some. I think there were hardly any. Well, I mean, let's try to go through them, right? And those of you in the audience, as you think about your own experience watching television, as a kid, I watched TV a lot. So, okay, let's start with Chips, right? The highway patrolman in Chips, right? Poncho. You think about Ricardo Montalban, who was in Fantasy Island in the late 70s and early 80s. There were a handful. But remember, I was in a city, I grew up in a city that was over 60% Latino. The 7th largest city in the country, in a neighborhoods, I moved 4 times around the west side of San Antonio. Some of those neighborhoods were more than 95% Latino. So as somebody who was living in that reality, to then watch American television and see almost none of that, you know, and that's why, I'll give you an example directly. I mean, when I went to college in California, and you know, I think Latinos made up at the time about 10% of the university, and people ask me once in a while, well, did you have culture shock? You know, was it so weird because you were going from this place that was so heavily Mexican American, and now you're going into this institution that is you know, so lightly Latino? And I said, and I thought, not really, because that's all I watched on television. Literally, that's all I watched on television was, you know, this American culture. And so for me, there was always it was always discordant, what I would see on screen and what I was living in my daily life.
So of the Latino characters that you grew up with, who was your favorite?
Oh, man. Well, like I said, I liked Poncho on Chips. I liked Ricardo Montalban. The others, like I'm struggling to remember now of the different shows, who was on there. You know, what are the other, in the late 80s and even in the early 90s? I remember some of the movies, right? So I remember La Bamba was big in the late 80s. Stand and Deliver in the early 90s. Those were great. I remember watching Zoot Suit because my mom was so involved in the Chicano civil rights movement that she had us watch Zoot Suit, for example. So some of the films as well. But those are just, I mean, those are a handful of examples. You know, when you've got a community that now represents almost 20% of the country.
So is the biggest problem the lack of Latino employment in the industry or the images of Latinos on screen?
You ask a great question because it's actually two separate things, right? There's the issue of workers and representation, and then there's the issue of portrayal and stories, right? The reason that the representation, in other words, who's in a writer's room, who's in a C-suite greenlighting projects, who is the casting director, who's the director, producer. The reason that those things matter, also who are the editors in a newsroom, the reason that those things matter is because the more diverse that lot of people is, the more likely you are to get accurate and authentic portrayals of the subject matter. And so I'm arguing that the lack of diversity in this end, in the industry, has led to those lopsided, uneven portrayals that then create a stigma over an entire community. So I think you start to solve one, it helps affect the other. And then just to go back a little bit, and I talked about this a lot over the last few years, not so much today because I've covered it a lot, but the reason media is important is because there's only so many ways that we get impressions of people that we don't know out in the world. Think about how you get an impression about other people. Either through your personal experience, you meet them, or something you learn about in the classroom, in public schools or universities, or oftentimes through mass media, right? So you've got a lot of people growing up in communities where they've hardly ever interacted with or spent a lot of time with anybody from the Latino community. In classrooms, we have been left out of American history textbooks and state history textbooks. When I was growing up in Texas, the only Latino or Hispanic figures that were covered, for the most part, were the folks at the Alamo. And so there you go. For a lot of people, no personal experience, no experience learning about anybody who's Latino in classrooms. And so now we get to the third piece, which is mass media, American media, right? And so that, to me, is why this is so impactful.
So how has media consolidation contributed to this
Well,
situation?
you go from 2 open doors to 1, and you go from an opportunity with 2 companies to an opportunity with 1 company that now has a lot more leverage and power over content creators and others. And so, and it's particularly troubling, at least on the diversity front, because some companies are better than others, and some companies are actually working in earnest more than others to fix this problem. So when I see a company that wants to merge or acquire another one, and the company that's doing the acquiring has been worse in its efforts than the company that's being acquired, I wonder which of those cultures is going to prevail. Is it going to be the acquiring company that's done almost nothing and doesn't seem to care about this as an issue? Or are they going to take that opportunity to bring in the culture that was developed by the one they're acquiring? And so that's part of a big concern. Obviously when you talk about antitrust, there's a lot of other issues about price and what it does for consumers and so forth. But the DOJ and the FTC put out a public call for folks, including members of Congress and other organizations, to submit suggestions about how they should take a look at antitrust law. They've got to follow the statute, they've got to follow the case law and so forth. It's not carte blanche to impose whatever criteria they want, but within the letter of the law and within the spirit of the law, how can we look at some of these
criteria and take it into account.
Can we talk about Latinos in media without talking about other underrepresented groups such as blacks and Asians? You touched on the topic a little bit during your remarks, but is the entertainment pie big enough for everyone?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely believe that it is. And remember, as I mentioned before, our conversation today is specifically on the Latino community. And it's on the Latino community because if you look at the percentage of the population, about 18.7% of the population now, and the percentage in the industry, there's the biggest gap with Latinos of any of the groups. But historically, certainly, and even today in many areas of media, African Americans are still shut out. Asian Americans are still shut out. So it's not an issue that's exclusive to the Latino community by any means. And where I've been able, I have tried to work in coalition with the Asian American community and the African American community to take on this issue. And I'll just give you a quick example of that. I worked with Karen Bass, who at the time was the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, and Judy Chu, head of CAPAC at the time, to request that the House Judiciary Committee do a hearing on these issues, and that hearing was done in November of 2020. And CAPAC and CBC at times have also taken on some of these media issues. So we've worked well together in the past.
There's a fine line between censorship and government control of contents. Are the recommendations in this report Big Brother's first step toward government deciding what is appropriate?
No, it's a plea to stop characterizing all Latinos as criminals and prostitutes and convicts and so forth. We're not telling you exactly, I'm not trying to tell anybody exactly how many people to hire, exactly which stories to run. I'm not saying that you're never going to see another Mexican-American drug dealer on television or on screen, but when an entire industry runs what is the equivalent of a negative political ad for decades over time, to me, that's not, and also Hard News has had the same problem, by the way, in a lot of their framing, and they suffer from the same problem. In fact, let me give you, since we're talking, do we have a second to do it?
We do.
Let me give you some of the numbers at some of the, what are considered the newspapers of record in the country, because I've been talking about Hollywood, but this is a problem for journalism as well. At the New York Times, at least the latest numbers that we had, maybe they're a little bit better by now, only 7% of staff are Latino. That's the nation's paper of record. At the Washington Post here in DC, only 5% of employees are Latino. And at the Los Angeles Times, in a city that's nearly 50% Latino, it's about 48% Latino, only 17% of reporters are Latino. And now I want to give credit to the LA Times in particular, because I actually think they're actually working hard to change that. Of those three, I think they're doing the most work to change that. But 7% at the New York Times, 5% at the Post. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great people that work there, a lot of wonderful journalists and editors and so forth, but they're failing. They are failing a large part of American society, and they are failing the country because they have been unwilling or unable to create a newsroom that's representative of the country.
So a lot of local newsrooms have disappeared in the last 10 years,
Right.
to the point that you were just making, and along with them, many Latino reporters. Can you tell us how fewer news outlets affect coverage of Latinos and the issues that are important to us? And with midterms coming up, should there be more Latinos covering those elections?
To answer your last question first, yeah, I absolutely think so.
Why is that important?
Well, I think because when somebody is part of a community, and it could be the Latino community, it could be the African American community, and let's get off of race and ethnicity. It could be women covering women's issues, because we're talking about people covering a particular community. It could be somebody from the LGBTQ plus community. When you have somebody who is familiar with the community in that way, and I'm not saying they're the only people that can cover the community, but I do think that they are less likely to cover a community as though they're looking into a petri dish. There is this issue that I have seen as a consumer, and somebody obviously is in politics who has interacted with a lot of reporters over many years. There's a tendency for reporters who are unfamiliar with a community, whatever it is, who go in there, who fly in, to treat it as though they are looking into a petri dish to try to figure it out.
that is a symptom of non-diverse newsrooms in whatever it may be. It could be race and ethnicity, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation.
I think it's also one of the reasons that people were shocked, especially political news editors and reporters, that Trump had captured as much of the Latino vote in Florida that he did in 2016. It goes, I think your point is very well taken.
Sure, but also to that, it also represents another failure of media, which is the failure to police or different kind of media, social media mostly on this point, but the failure to police disinformation in Spanish language press, right?
What is at stake if this trend of not having Latinos in media positions continues?
Well, I think you have, what's odd is that you have this growing population that's growing very quickly, and at the same time, a kind of invisibility or a misunderstanding of who the community is. And folks have heard me tell this story before, but we had a meeting with the Association of American Publishers in May of 2020, and I asked one of the CEOs of one of the top 5 publishing companies if he could name 3 Latinos or Latinas who had had a significant impact in American history. And he thought about it for a few seconds, and he finally said, no, I can't. So this is somebody that publishes textbooks for schools and for universities and can't think of 3 Latinos or Latinas as historical figures who have had any kind of impact on American history. So what it represents to me is a void in narrative. In other words, Americans don't know who Latinos are. They don't know who among you, Latino or Latina, has made an important contribution to the development or prosperity of the country in government, in business, in arts, in culture, in any industry. There is a danger, like I said, to having that void in narrative, to that black hole, because then it gets filled by all of these media stereotypes, and then it gets further twisted by unscrupulous and malevolent politicians who use it for their own political gain. And that's what we see today. So to answer your question, what happens is it gets even more dangerous for a big group of people in the United States.
So the former ASNI published for the last at least 35 years a census of newspapers on diversity. Television, NAHJ has done the same for television over the years.
Right.
We've had Hispanic Heritage Month for 30 years, if not longer, which highlight, or at least it's supposed to highlight, the contributions of Latino leaders in a variety of fields. Why aren't people listening? Why are we still, after 30 years, in this position?
Well, part of it is a corporate resistance to change. Just a flat-out corporate resistance to change. And let me use the example of the African American community, where now you finally have better African American representation across media platforms. Like I said, there's still a lot of big holes and a lot of underrepresentation. But that has finally, I believe, started to change in an earnest way. But quite honestly, with corporations, a lot of it happened after the murder of George Floyd. And there was a panic and a crisis of conscience, I'll call it, that something had to change. But think about what that means in the United States, that it took collectively the nation and the nation's corporate leaders watching the murder of a black man on film for corporate America to finally decide that it was going to change. So a lot of it is corporate resistance. They have the power to change. They've resisted that so far.
Before we wrap up today's discussion and ask a final question, let me take a moment to thank headliners, co-team leaders Donna Leinwand-Leger and Lori Russo, the headliners team member who organized today's event, Peter Copeland, club membership director Kate Helster, and club executive director Bill McCarran. I would also like to remind those in the room as well as our viewers online of our next newsmaker this Friday, October 7th, with climate activist and UN Goodwill Ambassador Vanessa Nakate. Our thanks to Congressman Castro and to Ms. Perez for joining us today. We want to present you with our National Press Club mug
Thank you.
as a token of our thanks. And we hope you'll be back to the club in the near future. Thanks for being with us today, both of you. And now for the final question. Why should non-Latinos care about this issue? What's at stake for them?
Well, let me start with this because it affects everyone. Well, first, I would hope that people want to understand a community that's such a large part of the United States of America and gives so much in positive contributions to the health and prosperity of our country. But as I mentioned, to not understand this community is dangerous not only to Latinos, but to non-Latinos. And I use the example of El Paso, where when that madman drove 10 hours from Dallas to El Paso and killed 23 people and injured more than 20 others because he considered them Hispanic invaders to Texas, the only people killed or injured were not just Latino Americans. There were others as well. So it's dangerous for everyone, for this community to be invisible and misunderstood.
Thank you, Representative Castro. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
Perez, and thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you so much.